Evan, thank you very much for joining us. You are an editor and you've been around for quite some time, starting out as an assistant editor on some big pictures, including Pan's Labyrinth and Hellboy. You've cut some big films as well as an editor. Most recently, Frankenstein was Guillermo del Toro. So thanks very much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about your start out in the industry. How did you get into editing and why did you choose editing? And why have you stuck with it?
So while I was in college, I was working at Stan Winston's studio, and they had an Avid at Stan's that nobody knew how to use, but they had, video editing needs. And so that was happening at the same time that I was taking production classes and writing and doing, and shooting and doing sound design and directing and everything. And I found kind of at this, at the same time that I was editing at Stan's, these like demo reels, I was editing my own short films at USC and realizing like, oh, this is actually the thing that I want to do. In the first production class at USC, you make one film every 3 weeks and then you do everything and you bring it in for critique. And I started talking with my other classmates and realizing that they all hated spending their like Saturday editing, whereas for me, I was like, oh, thank God I'm no longer on set anymore. I hate that part of it. I just want to edit. And so I sort of, I took that as a sign, and as I was able to focus more on editing in school and focus more on editing at Stan's, this idea, for me sort of like coalesced around like, okay, I'm going to become an editor after I graduate. So I my time at Stan Winston's got me in the union very quickly after I graduated. And then I started looking for assistant editor work, lucked into a job on Pan's Labyrinth that then led to a job on Hellboy 2 as a first assistant editor. And that was my first, experience working with Guillermo.
What was that like? Pan's Labyrinth and then Hellboy, pretty early on in your career as an assistant editor. Very curious to know how that came to be, what it was like, and then also did that have any bearing on you actually cutting Frankenstein?
Yeah, I mean, it was luxurious. It's not often that early in your career you get to work for a guy like Guillermo. I had actually seen Guillermo during. When he came to USC to do this Q&A class that Leonard Maltin teaches. So I'd seen him in like 2004 when I was in that class. And then by 2006, I was actually like working with him, which was pretty crazy. But, in Pan's Labyrinth, I got this email that I don't still to this day don't know how I got the email, but I got an email from a post executive that was looking for an assistant editor based in LA who could speak Spanish to work on post-production for Pan's Labyrinth. They had shot it in Spain and they had rented a house in Woodland Hills for the editor, and it was a 2-bedroom house. So there was one Avid in one bedroom and there was the editor in the other bedroom. And I ended up getting that job. And then since there was only one Avid, there was no place for me to go when Guillermo would show up and he and Bernat would edit together. So I would just stay in the room and watch them edit and became comfortable, giving my opinion and talking with them as equals, which is a thing that Guillermo very much encouraged, and Bernat as well. I could freely enter Bernat's office no matter who was in there. So if a Universal executive was in there talking with Guillermo and looking at a cut, I could just go quietly, take a seat in the corner and observe, and nobody said anything. And so that was an amazing educational experience. When it came time for Frankenstein, my agents told me that Guillermo's producer was looking for an editor, and so they submitted my resume and told him that I had experience. But I went directly to Guillermo on Twitter and I DM'd him and I said, "Hey, I had such a great time on Pan's Labyrinth and on Hellboy 2. I would love to do this again with you." And he got back to me pretty much instantly and was like, "Yeah, send me your contact info." And so I did, and then very shortly I had a script, and then a little bit after that I had a meeting, and I went in for the meeting, and I waited an hour for him to finish some Zoom calls, and he came out and he was 1 foot out the door, and his assistant was like, "Hey, you have an editor you need to interview." And he looked at it, he's like, "Oh yeah, oh hey Evan, yeah, you're hired." And and that was how I got the job. And he was like, "Yeah, they wanted to do a Zoom with you," but I was like, "Dude, I know this guy, I don't need to do a Zoom with him." And so it was entirely because that experience of working together on those 2 movies, and I think the trust that we built up.
So that's quite rare, I think, where not all directors are like that. Not all a lot of assistant editors I speak to don't have that experience with directors. So having assistants come into the room, showing them cuts, talking openly and freely, which is amazing. And it sounds like Guillermo was like that with you early on in your career, which would have been a great education, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And he was very open with everybody, on Hellboy 2, when he had a bigger crew, we'd all go out to lunch together. If he had his, if Alfonso Cuarón was coming in, or Alejandro Iñárritu, or any of his other, friends were coming into like editorial to watch something, we would all, I would be more than welcome in those rooms and go out to the lunch afterwards where they talk about the film. It was really like included a lot in a way that later as an assistant editor for working for other directors, I certainly, wasn't. And then I got to those jobs and realized like, oh, it was not, it's not always like it is with Guillermo. Some directors don't have that relationship or don't value editing as much or whatever it is. But, Guillermo very much enjoys being an editorial. He values editing and he values your opinion. And so, yeah, on my current film, I certainly put my assistants through the paces also of inviting them in and being like, okay, here's 2 competing cuts. I'm not going to tell you which one I like and which one Guillermo likes, but you're just going to have to watch it and figure out which one you like and tell us. That was a thing that I experienced when I was an assistant editor that, is fun to do now with my assistant editors.
To talk a little bit about Frankenstein in particular then, you mentioned that you'd started sort of 4 days after the start shooting in Toronto. You'd had your Avid set up. From that point on, were you keeping up to speed with the shoot? How soon after did you wrap? Did you have an assembly? How was cutting during production?
Guillermo likes to cut every day, and on this film, he liked to cut 2 hours before call every day. So whatever they shot on Monday, I would come in at 4 hours before call on Tuesday morning. So if call was 8 a.m., I would come in at like 4 a.m. and I would spend 2 hours with my assistant, loading dailies and organizing and cutting and doing a quick assembly. And then he would come in at 6 a.m. and we would edit. And then by the time that he went off to set at 8 a.m. to go shoot, we had a cut of the previous day's material that he was happy with. And then we would integrate that into, the growing reels that we had. By doing that, he was able to, adjust the day ahead if he needed to get a shot that he didn't get the day before. It would also allow him to start thinking about what he was going to be shooting the day after that. And since he's the screenwriter, he could go home on the weekends and he could adjust the script going forward. And sometimes, the actors would come in, or oftentimes Dan Lauschton, who I've worked before with as a cinematographer, he would come in and he and Guillermo would talk about like, okay, let's start the day, with the crane over here. They would figure out what their plan is. And it was always just a very open cutting room. It's
usual in productions I've been on where you've cut the previous day's stuff by the end of today.
By the end of the day,
but
yeah.
Not the beginning.
Not the beginning of the day.
So I think that's really impressive on 2 fronts, which is that Guillermo could come in and do that for 2 hours every day before shooting, actually get his head into editing and cutting and do 2 hours of that and then go and shoot all day. And then secondly, on your part and Britt's part is to actually come into the cutting room at 4 o'clock in the morning, load rushes in for 2 hours. To assemble everything from the day before is also very, very impressive.
We were definitely pushing the limits of the dailies turnaround because like they would wrap, at 7 or 8 at night or something like that. And then it would go off, the cards would go off to Company 3 and Company 3 would have to do their thing and then upload to us. And, sometimes we would come in and the upload had finished like 15 minutes before we got into the office. So it was always a little bit of a thing.
Yeah,
and then
right.
When we were in Scotland, that was definitely kind of the hardest part of this because we were on location. We had a trailer. We were carrying around, like NAS boxes that we would jack Ethernet cables into and treat as our Nexus. And for that, we had somebody from Company 3 who was also traveling with us. And so there was this like dailies, person who was going with us who I never actually met. We just traded emails because we were on completely opposite schedules. When she was working, we were sleeping and vice versa. And so we would just show up at her hotel or the unit driver would go to her hotel before picking us up in the morning, and so at like 3:30 in the morning, we're doing like a dead drop of hard drives at a hotel, reception desk before then going out to our trailer and, loading stuff in. And it was tricky to get that timing right. And for the most part, it was okay. There were definitely like a couple days where we were very, very close to not making our deadline.
Talk to me a little bit about speed in editing, because I have to imagine that you cut incredibly fast. I like to think myself as someone who cuts very fast, but when I used to cut. And there aren't very many editors who can do that. I feel just from the experience I've had. Do you think it does something to the edit? Or, if you were to cut If you weren't able to cut as fast as you do you think that the result would be the same in terms of the actual story and the edit?
I don't think for me that it changes the end result if I cut quickly or cut slowly. I mean, Guillermo needs somebody who can cut very quickly. That was the only question actually that he asked me in my interview, was like, you cut fast, try it. And I was like, yes. And there was a point during Toronto where he invited crew members in to watch us edit at 6 a.m, and a bunch of them took him up on it, and some of them would go and they'd sit on the couch with Guillermo and they'd watch the TV that he was watching, and some of them would come behind my desk and they would watch what I was doing. And then after Guillermo would leave to go to set, the ones that had been sitting behind me would be like, oh wow, you really like have to be like on it, when he's in the room. And I'm like, yeah, you do. Because by the time he's finishing giving the note, he wants to see it immediately. It's like, right. There's no time for like give me 5 minutes, to put this together. It's just like, okay, he likes throwing things out at you and I'm just starting to work as he's still talking. And then by the time that he finishes talking, I have maybe 5 or 10 seconds before he's like, okay, play. And I'm like, oh, okay, hold on. So you do have to be fast. But at the same time, after you do that, you're still watching what you've done back. And, and if you've cut something, too short or too long, or, you're still making adjustments. So the actual speed at which you're putting the edit together is not, necessarily determinative of how the edit feels, because you're still checking your work as you go. Guillermo shoots with a lot of intention, but it's really, he also expects you to, when he walks in at 6 a.m, he expects you to like know everything and have memorized all the different takes and what the differences are. And so, there just isn't time to do that. So I would definitely kind of, if I was in a rush, I would start with the selects and, and then make my choices from there. And then if I finished the scene early before he came in, then I would start going through and be like, okay, well, like, is there anything that I missed in the things that were not selects? But Guillermo also knows his footage like very, very well. So he would come in and be like, oh, I see you use take 3. He'll know that.
He'll know that without actually.
He'll know that without looking
right.
at. He'll know that just by the performance that he's seeing on screen or the camera move or whatever. And he'll be like, I see you use take 3, but like let's try take 5. There was a look in there, from Christoph Waltz that I wanted.
Right.
And so that also helps, because I feel like also a lot of directors, they get to post and they have no idea what they've shot, but like Guillermo probably to this day can look at something and be like, yeah, that was take 8.
And it probably also helps that he's doing it every day, right? So it's not like he's only coming into the cutting room 3 months or 4 months.
Right. I have not met anybody that has cut their entire day of dailies before the next shoot day.
Right. Yeah.
That is very uncommon. You can cut on sets, and there's certainly like cutting on set, but that's a different like kind of cutting. I think I've done that too for reshoots, where you sort of get things, you slot things in. Paul Mackless does this for Edgar Wright. He cuts on set as they're going, which for a film like Baby Driver you have to do. But I find when I'm cutting on set, even if I'm caught up to camera by the end of the day, it's you make different choices when you're dealing with only a portion of whatever they've shot for the scene that day, and so you're constantly kind of have to go back and be like, oh, now they just shot the other side, all right, so let me go integrate that, and like now they shot an insert, all right, let me find what it's different. You cut the scene differently than when you have everything in front of you all in one go.
Yeah. And then in terms of where you were at by the end of the shoot, presumably pretty far along in the cuts.
Yeah. So the other thing that we did is that my work week was shifted by a day. So if the crew was shooting Monday to Friday, I was on a Tuesday to Saturday, and that was so that Guillermo could come in and edit all day on Saturday. We shot for 4 months in Toronto, and then we did a miniature shoot in the UK, and miniature shoots are very, very slow. They spend most of the day setting up the shot for about, 10 or 20 minutes or whatever to actually shoot it. And so we would edit in the morning and into the afternoon up until they were ready for Guillermo to go on to the miniature set, and direct that. So we basically got a month of editing there. And then we moved up to Glasgow, and we had 3 weeks of pre-production before the Scotland shoot. So we were just editing throughout that time. So by the time that we got back to LA, we were like far more advanced in terms of where our cut was than even a director's cut. And I think we were showing it to, some of Guillermo's like famous director friends for notes and feedback within 3 weeks of getting back to LA.
Oh, wow. Did that mean the whole post schedule was condensed somewhat, or did you end up using the 12?
The immovable object in the post schedule was visual effects. Uh-huh. So particularly like the wolves and all the CG animals, we shot those early in Toronto. We turned them over within the week that we shot them, but they took the whole time in order to finish. Like, I think had we had a normal workflow where I cut an assembly and then he watches it and we do 10 make director's cut and all that kind of thing, then my assembly probably would have been 3 hours and 40 minutes. But by the time that we got back to LA after the shoot, we were running, I think, 235 or maybe 240 at most.
Oh, wow.
And so that whole time from like October 2024 to when we locked in like April or May of this year, was just taking out those 20 minutes every day. It was like, okay, can we get 5 seconds here or 10 seconds there? Just this, like there was a lot of like just cutting for time, and then also responding to the notes that we were getting, of course, in terms of like there were some minor structural changes in terms of story, some beats that got lifted. And it was a very thoughtful process. We were never in a hurry during post-production.
Yeah, right. Except for during the shoot.
But during post-production, we were never in a hurry. During the shoot, we were very much in a hurry.
Yeah, right. Right, and I was actually going to lead me on to my next question around the film, which is very tight and concise, and I don't feel like it labors on any point at all. But I'm just curious the way Guillermo works and the script. How much was there that you actually condensed or chucked out, and how much was there that it's kind of just as per the script?
The film is still very much to the script. The things that we took out, thankfully, they're things that we just realized we could lose without actually losing any of the things that we liked that were important to the story. Like after the confessional scene, for example, there was more in that church, and that was like an area where we kept like trying to find ways to shorten it until ultimately one day we're just like, do we even need this? And then out it went, and we just go directly from interior of the confessional to the dinner that they're at. So it was things like that where it was just like there was more detail, there was more information, but none of it was truly essential. And so those are the things that we lost.
In terms of performances, I think Oscar Isaac is pretty impressive, to put it lightly. Is how much does Guillermo shoot? Is it sort of like does he print pretty quickly? Are you doing a huge amount of tweaking performances and using lines from different takes over other video takes, or are you cutting it pretty straight?
He shoots, I'd say, like 4 to 8 takes on average, and gives the actors a ton of leeway to try things and to do what is coming naturally to them. We do have a bunch of places throughout the film where we have put lines in actors' mouths that they are not actually saying from other places, but that's not really performance so much as it is it's just like condensing. Where like in order to make, cutting these 15 seconds work, we've got to keep this one line that would otherwise get cut out. And, and so we're going to fit it in somewhere else. So that's not, we're not doing a lot of like very fine tuned, like we have no split screens where we're like using, take 3 from an actor on one side and take 5 from a different actor and, on another side.
Right.
We don't have any of that on this. This is very, and I don't think that Guillermo likes to work that way. Like, I think he'd rather just get the take.
It strikes me as such. There are other directors who I won't name who seem to spend all their days doing split screens and going on about it. And then my next question around just the way Guillermo works. Was he in the cutting room obviously daily during production, and during post production? How much is he in? How much is he out? Is he away? Does he leave you to it? What does that look like?
He doesn't often leave me to it. I wish he would leave me to it a little bit more, but he's very he wants to be there. I mean, that's one of the great things about having a director that, that loves editing and recognizes the power of editing so much, is that he does want to be there all the time when the editing is happening. There are a couple of times where he would be like, I want to cut time, somewhere in this 10-minute chunk, we need to cut like a few minutes out, I feel like. So, can you work on how to do that? But oftentimes he comes in with the things that he wants to do. He's got his little mental checklist of like the things he's been thinking about as he's been watching the movie at home on his laptop, and he comes, he's like, all right, I want to try this, and this. And so in post-production, because we had done so much of the editing during the shoot, he might come in 3 days a week. It might maybe at 5 days if he has a bunch of things that like are occurring to him, and then there'd be weeks where he would come in less. But he usually would just like come in and be like, all right, these are the things I want to do today, and then we would do them, and then he would leave. Right. And obviously he's got many other things on his plate for this movie and other movies that he's working on, and so I think when you have his attention, then you have his entire attention, and then he's got to go do other stuff.
Yeah, totally. There's a line in the film which I'm going to butcher if I try and quote it, so I won't try and quote it, but it's basically, he creates the creature, and then it's sort of like he hadn't put any thought about what would happen once he'd done that. The horizon is kind of there's this feeling of emptiness.
Yeah.
As a weird way to try and bring that back to editing, you were far more advanced than the director's cut by the end of the shoot. So you've got, by the sounds of it, 8-9 month period where there's not a huge amount of changes necessarily being made or massive structural things being done in the edit. Does it get boring?
No. I mean, the only part of the like post process that I find tedious is QCing.
Yeah.
At the very end when the movie's done, the edit is locked, you print mastered already, and it's just like, please come in and watch the movie 6 times in the span of 2 days. Like that I find tedious. And then if you notice a QC issue, then you've got to do more QCs after that. You've just earned yourself the right to do more QCs.
You also become quite unpopular in the post production.
Yeah, and we had a little bit on that because we had these like rolling deadlines. There was the Venice Film Festival delivery deadline, and then there was then there was TIFF that was like a week later, and then there was the Netflix on service deadline and the theatrical deadline and the print 35 millimeter print deadline, and so we were noticing things that we needed to fix. And so some versions had some fixes and some versions had other fixes because of this rolling thing. But all that meant is that there was like 2 weeks that we were just constantly going to Deluxe, QCing, and it was that was a lot. But I think that like as you're going through, you're always watching the movie for different things, and you're like watching other people watch the film and getting their notes and seeing it through their eyes and experiencing it in a different way, and like to that example. We got back in October, and in April we had 3 days. This is actually going to get to you a little bit. In April of 2025, we had 3 days of remote editing with Alfonso Cuarón, where Guillermo and I were in Toronto and Alfonso was in Paris. And we sent him a Louper link and spent those 3 days with him, and we cut 5 minutes out.
Oh, wow.
So we've been like living with the film for so many months at winnowing it down, and we were like feeling pretty good about it. And then Alfonso comes in and he's like, yeah, we can lose like 5 minutes. And you're like, okay, let's do it. And I don't miss a single thing. I can't even tell you all the things that like we took out, because like once they're gone and you realize that you didn't need them, then they just feel like they've always been gone.
What was that like, just out of curiosity, with Alfonso? Presumably you'd sent him a cut and he watched it on his own and then joined a Louper session 3 days and you cut together like that?
I think
what was the actual process? Was it frustrating? Was it okay? Was it fun?
No, it was great. That was some of my favorite days, actually. They were, again, as seemed to be the theme for this show. They started stupidly early in the morning because he was, I guess from the East Coast, he would be 6 hours ahead in Paris, and so I think I got into Company 3 in Toronto at 4:30 in the morning again.
Right.
I was like, oh, we're back in the shoot. Like, but no, Guillermo had gone to London and had shown a bunch of people in London at DCP. And that had been a month or two earlier, I think. And so then with Alfonso, we had these 3 days that they calendared, and then we just started at reel 1 and we just played through, and then he would be like, okay, stop. Why did you do this? This is confusing, or this is over explained, and he and Guillermo and I would just have, this sort of ongoing conversation as we were playing through the reels, and sometimes he would be like, I don't think you need to do half of this stuff. And Guillermo would get a little like antsy and be like, I don't want to watch you like mangle this scene, so I'm going to leave for 20 minutes. And then he would let Alfonso do whatever Alfonso wanted to do. And then he'd come back in and watch it. And most of the time he was like, okay, yes, okay, fine, I agree. And sometimes he would just be like, no, I like the way that I had it and let's put it back. Yes. But no, it was really fun. And Alfonso's a great editor. So, to get to like talk with him and to go back and forth with him. And there were certainly, times where he would give a note where he was like, this is what I feel, but I don't know your dailies. I don't know how to solve it, but this is generally the feeling of what, I think should be happening here and instead of what is happening here. And then I would be like, okay, give me, 5 minutes and because I know the dailies, and let me go through it. And I think I know what you want. And I would put that together and go from there. So no, I found that actually those 3 days were very, very fun and creative. And
was there a reason he didn't just time or didn't actually fly out to you guys, or was it just easy enough to do it online the way you did it?
It's just easy enough to do it online. Yeah. I mean, I don't know exactly where he was in France, but I think that the technology works, and they seem happy with it, and so the costs of flying a director, internationally and putting them up, it's pretty expensive.
Did you feel that it was a worthy tool in terms of actual editing and telling a story?
Yeah, so I think the first experience that I had with Louper on this show was as a viewer. We did a sound spotting session with our team in Toronto, and I was like, oh, this is cool, and this works better than most of the other solutions that I've tried. And so that stuck with me. That spotting session was early on in post-production. And then we were getting to a part of the schedule where Guillermo was doing a lot of traveling, but he still wanted to be able to to make tweaks and cuts and things. And, as I said, he likes doing that in real time. He doesn't want to send me notes and then have me send him a cut and then have this very asynchronous thing. He wants to do it while we're on the line together. Actually, during production, we had another solution that we tried once when he was at his apartment, and then I was in the production office, and he lasted 30 seconds, and he was like, this is super laggy. And I was like, I mean, it's probably not fair. I think he was on Wi-Fi, and there were all sorts of things that were maybe making his experience less than stellar, but he was just still like, no, I'm not going to do this. And so that's when I was like, okay, well, let's go back to Louper and see if we can make that work. So I was a little nervous, try doing a round 2 with him, but he took to it, and he had no complaints, and he understood how to use the platform and everything. I would get on in this room, actually this is my home office, and it's 7 or 8 a.m. or something, because he was so far ahead of me on the other side of the world, and we would edit for a couple of hours, and we did that very successfully. And so then when it came time to work with Alfonso, it was just okay, well, we know that this works.
The asynchronous thing is interesting because we both came up in cutting rooms and doing stuff. There was no kind of concept of remote work, right? But it's kind of there are so many decisions that are made in editing. There's so much context. You're making all these minute decisions and big decisions every minute. Things are influencing one another. You're dealing with Guillermo and then him talking back, and there's so many tiny decisions to end up with a cut. Even if it's only the first 20 seconds of a scene. Trying to do that asynchronously sounds ludicrous. It sounds, as crazy as trying to have this conversation by sending text messages back and forth. Yeah. So I think it's kind of crazy to do. And that whole thing around real-time conversation is how films have always been made. Do you think there is any place for asynchronous work, or do you think it depends on the director, or?
It depends on the director. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish that day. I mean, the types of edits that Guillermo wants to do make sense to do synchronously, and the bigger things, he wants to be there for that. I think where you get a director who has less of one of the things about Guillermo that you can find out from everybody, he's incredibly specific no matter what you ask him. And sometimes you work with directors and they don't know exactly what they want. They'll come in and they'll be like, I feel something, something in these 5 minutes is bothering me. I don't know what it is, and then at that point, asynchronous makes more sense, because in any time when nobody's looking over my shoulder to be like, well, maybe it's this and maybe it's that. And how does this work? And what happens if I do this? And, you need some room to try things that will fail in order to kind of diagnose whatever is bugging your director. But, Guillermo often comes in and he's just like, this specific thing is bugging me, and let's attack it and let's fix it together.
Right.
And so that, very much is a synchronous, we need to do this in real time task.
For sure. Does he change his mind a lot? Will he go back to something he did yesterday, or is he pretty adamant that that's what he wants and he's got it and he can move on?
He commits. I mean, even to like the cuts that we were doing 2 hours before a call every day, like a lot of those are in the movie that is finished. Those takes didn't necessarily change. Like he's not going back and like reevaluating which performance he likes better. It's not to say that we never changed a take, but it just wasn't like, he's very much like, oh nope, this is the take that I want. And sometimes if something wasn't working and we had to change a take, I'd be like, okay, we have 10 takes of this. And he'd be like, all right, start from take 1. And we get to take 3 and he'd be like, that one. And I'd be like, do you want to see the other like 7? He'd be like, no, that's the one. Like, okay.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, he definitely like, he commits, which is also, great. You don't have to like do a bunch of work and then worry that he's going to come in the next day and be like, what about 5 other versions? But the other thing that actually that was really nice about working synchronously and being able to do that while he was in a different time zone is that I was jumping into my system in Santa Monica from my house, elsewhere. And so being able to like start the Louper session on my system in Santa Monica, but join it from, I borrowed my wife's MacBook Air, so that the video of me was coming from a separate computer, and so that was actually really cool too, to be able to do that.
Oh, fun. And how much of that did you do? Like how many days like that did you do? Was it a lot?
It was like, I think 3 weeks kind of off and on for, sometimes it was 10 minutes and sometimes it was an hour.
Right.
Like it wasn't ever very long, but he would kind of do it, I think, before he would go out to dinner, whatever he'd been like thinking of that day. And anytime that we made his, like the rule was anytime that we made a picture change, we would render out an entirely new QuickTime of the whole movie for him and send it to him. And so he would we would do that. We would send him the whole film. He would then, at 2 a.m. or whenever he's, like back and kind of awake thinking about the movie, he would be scrolling through the QuickTime. And then the next day he'd be like, okay, I watched, the whole movie through and these are the other things that I want to change.
So there's one montage, well, there are a few montages in the film. There's one I want to talk about in particular. And it contained shots, I think it definitely contained shots that I actually couldn't, I don't have a very strong stomach. I couldn't look at the screen for something. and it's
the body assembly montage.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the sound plays obviously as important a part as the picture does for that. That montage and the music is kind of it's a waltz. It's kind of light and not in line. And I know Alexandre Desplat did the score. I worked with Alexandre Desplat on The Danish Girl, and very interesting guy. Very cool recording session. And that one actually was interesting because during post and that he was away on holiday, like just before the recording of the score, and he was writing, we were sending him something ridiculous, like, it was like unbelievably bad internet where we had to get each reel down to like 50 megabytes. I mean, it was like he was working like a 320p QuickTime. It was ridiculous. So in that the body assembly montage, I think, is a waltz. And
it is.
Yeah, it's very light in a way. The mood changes from what you're seeing on screen because of the music. But there's also this sort of real care taken by Victor in the assembly of the body. I also got the sense that there was probably a huge amount of material shot for that montage. I'm curious as to how that came about and why it looks very sort of precise and like he takes great pride in his work.
Yeah, it's not really supposed to be a horror moment. Obviously, it's a gory moment. But this is definitely Victor, in his element. You could even dare to say he's having fun. It's supposed to be, he is making something artistic. As Mike Hill says, he's not, like, the creature is not supposed to look like a car wreck victim. That was an area where they shot the montage in the course of a day, and I put it together, and that was like normally a cut without music. But in this instance, it's a montage that sort of needs music as they're cutting it together. So I went and I found a waltz from Crimson Peak that Alexandre also composed, and I stuck that in, and that worked great, and so great actually that it lived all the way through post-production. And there was another waltz that we tried when we got into post at somebody else's suggestion, which was a Shostakovich, Jazz Suite No. 2. And that also worked in a slightly different way. Both of them were good depending on kind of the mood of the day. Guillermo would switch back and forth between them. And then, Alexandre ultimately composed, his waltz for our movie, which was perfect. So, I mean, that was really fun actually to cut together. I don't find I know that like once you get the sound in there and if you've never seen the footage before, it can feel a little gross. But I guess for me, like given my history, like working at a special effects studio early in my career, that stuff doesn't like I don't that doesn't make me cringe at all when I see those footage. That kind of footage.
It's a huge part of it is the sound, right? It's that typical
it's
gory,
the fleshy like
yeah. It
so.
really kind of like makes me wince. On sound, it's something you and I spoke about a lot. In 2014 over email, you take sound really seriously in editorial because it's such an important part of the process, right? Has that always been the case for you since the beginning? Was it something you learned from another editor? How did that come about? And do you find that it somehow influences or impacts? I mean, of course, it does impact the editorial process, but do you ever find, just from a practical time standpoint, like I'm spending so much time doing sound and I should actually be cutting picture? How do you balance that?
Sound for me has always been something I've liked doing. It's always something that I find important. Earlier in my career when I was an assistant editor, I worked on a bunch of like fight movies, they're like Warrior and Rocky Balboa, Rambo, all for the same editor, Sean Albertson. And so I like started sort of, building a library and figuring out, like how to do temp sound design. But I would say that I didn't really take it to the next level until I was an assistant editor on Star Trek Into Darkness. And that was the first show that I worked on where Media Composer allowed mixing in surround sound in 5.1. And so, J.J. Abrams had been talking with his post-executive, Ben Rosenblatt, at the time about, not wanting to have to stop down for to do a temp mix while he was editing. He just wanted to be able to edit, all the way up until the morning, of a preview screening if necessary. And so I went to Ben when this new version of Media Composer came out, and I was like, look, I think we can do this now. And Ben hired a whole bunch of people, so basically hired me and, a couple other assistant editors, and then Will Files, who was a re-recording mixer from Skywalker. And Will came down and supervised this like team of assistant editors. And so I ended up doing most of the effects mixing, most of the general sort of like temp mixing. And then we had another assistant editor who was doing dialogue cleanup and dialogue editing. And then, a third guy that was, doing Foley and like, that guy, Robbie Stambler, had a huge library on his own from his father because his father was a sound editor. And so like Robbie would, mine this library for cool sounds. And then Will was supervising all of us and teaching us tricks as we were going on like how to make things sound a certain way and, how to have intelligible dialogue. And so like on my website, I offer these downloadable bin of like track effects that you can stick on your dialogue tracks to make that. All it basically does is like cuts the top and the bottom end out and, boosts the middle and there's like a de-esser and a compressor and a few other things. But that comes from Will. Like Will created those on Star Trek, and then, I just sort of package them up and put them on my website with an explanation of what they do. So it was really that show of like getting to focus entirely on sound for like 6 months straight with the supervision of, of a Skywalker, re-recording mixer, like sitting literally next to me being like, okay, here's some tricks and here's how you do this. And, that after that, I feel like, my temp tracks got way better, and now my poor assistants, have the expectations that I have of like, this is how good that it must sound. And, and they do great. Like my longtime assistant editor, Britt DeLillo, who was on with me on this and was also with me on the Marvels. Like on the Marvels, we never did a temp mix. We had a bigger crew, we had access to a theater. And everybody had 5.1 in their rooms. So, on that, like, they mined, the assistant editor's crew on that mined every Marvel movie that we had access to and created their own library of Marvel sound effects, and so we just like, they just went to town and we had a really, really complex, complete sound mix that we would take to I think we did 8 preview screenings on that movie. So, it's really important because like in as much as you can have a preview screening for, either a full, 300 person audience or even just 2 of your friends. Like if you get in front of them and you'd be like, okay, here's all the disclaimers as every director always does. Like it's, temp sound, it's temp color, it's temp VFX, it's temp music, all the like, don't take anything too seriously. You can say all that and you can put it on a card before the movie starts, but in the end, it doesn't really matter because it still bumps people and they still get drawn out, and you still get notes at the end that were like, why didn't you, particularly from a preview audience, you get that question they ask of like, what prevented you from rating this movie a 5 if you rated it a 4? And somebody inevitably in the audience goes, well, it's not done yet. And you're like, yes, we know, obviously it's not done yet, but it's like, it's this block that you just can't get over. So the more that you can make the movie feel like it is complete, even if it's very far from being complete, the more valuable feedback that you get from the people you're showing it to.
And do you find that you're focused on it really early on, so kind of every day, even during production, or do you spend some time after the shoot kind of cleaning it all up, or do you kind of do it as you go?
It's definitely iterative. We do a lot of it during that day that we've assembled it. But, I find that like you do all of that and then you get to post, and then, sound is a very slippery slope. So like often if we are not engaging our supervising sound editors, we're just doing it in editorial, you get to post-production and, and maybe you've done the hard effects like gunshots and door closes and things like that before, but then you start putting in footsteps and you realize, oh shoot, now that I've put in one footstep, I have to put in every footstep. And so that's what I mean. It's like you go through it and you start building out and making it more complex. But once you open one little door, then you're like, now I have to do this whole thing because every place where I haven't done footsteps now sounds empty. And through that process, you end up building a very complex, soundtrack.
You mentioned earlier on about showing the film to other people, not just in the previous screening, but people coming to the cutting room and actors having come into the cutting room. There's this phenomena that every editor I speak to seems to know exactly what I'm talking about, and I've never found a phrase for it. Maybe we need to invent one around the cut a scene, great. You watch it a few times, you make changes, you're happy with it, and the second you show it to someone else, it feels different, or there's something that there's maybe a dozen things that bother you that didn't bother you when watching it on your own. Curious if that's kind of the same for you pretty much all the time, and if there is a solution.
Yeah, I normally that is the case. On this one, for some reason, that didn't happen. But like Steven Spielberg watched it early on, and I wasn't in the room for that. I'm sure if I was in the room for that, I would have been cringing, at all sorts of things that I didn't realize. But
and how about, so it sounds like Guillermo shows it to a bunch of director friends. Did you find that useful as well, getting feedback from other directors?
None of them ever gave us like pages of notes. They always sort of distilled their thoughts into like, these are the 5 things that I thought as I was watching the film. And like a couple times you get something a day later, an email a day later or something like that. That would be like, and here's one other thought actually that occurred to me on my drive home. But you don't like, because I think the thing that about preview screening focus groups that I find particularly annoying is like the group think that somebody says something and then some other person is like, oh yeah, now that you mention it, even though I didn't experience it while I was watching the film, that bothers me now in retrospect, The
other thing that directors do is I need something here and I don't know what, but I'll know it when I see it.
Yes.
And that can be fun, but that can also be completely infuriating.
yes, it can. These directors, they don't do that. So
good. A question on going back to your early days as a student and having your peers not wanting to cut or finding being in the cutting room so boring, which always surprises me because I feel like that's kind of the final stage of storytelling and like the ultimate stage of storytelling. And it's actually, it's kind of like you get to deal with everything and it's so much fun. I always find it surprising when people don't like editing. It's so important. There's a quote, and I can never remember the director. It's a big director who says that, if they're being frivolous, they would say the only reason they ever shoot is so that they can edit.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it appeals to a bunch of things that I'm good at, that I have interests in, as well as probably my desire to like control the creation of the thing until the last possible second. I really like the fact that like we are the ones that are putting the film together, and we're also basically the ones that the last people to have our hands on it. But editing itself, it's like, it's an art that involves, it's visual storytelling. It's sound, aural storytelling. So I played piano as a kid for like 20 years. I love the music editing part of it. I love syncing, finding good music to sync up with the montage I've just put together. I think that there's just something really satisfying about constructing this thing from all the ingredient pieces and making it feel like a cohesive story that is engaging and dynamic. And then also the tech part of it. I've always been a very techie person. I do coding on the side when I'm unemployed. And so this is, the editing is like, it's technology, it's art, it's, it's music, it's, sound, it's photography, and it's troubleshooting often, which is also something that I find that I'm pretty good at in editing and elsewhere, of just like, of triaging what is missing and what do we need to add.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's very well put. I think is where you touched on troubleshooting, which can also be called problem solving. I guess that's also what drew me to it, is like, actually there's all these problems and some of them are like bigger than others, and there's this sort of massive satisfaction when you solve a problem in storytelling through editing, and finding problems and solving bigger problems and often creating new problems as a result. But I think that's what it is. You can solve this puzzle in 1,000 different ways, and some of them are more efficient than others, and some of them, are cleaner than others, and and it's just like, how does your brain figure out, what version of the solution you want to go with? Yes, and also when is the solution, a kind of a final or passable solution or great solution? Because that was the other thing I found, and I got much better at it very, very quickly on when I started cutting professionally. I was an assistant editor and worked with some really great editors, where I learned the idea that you cut it and you've made all your decisions and you move on. I didn't have that. I was like, you can edit forever. If there's nothing stopping you. You can just keep going and going and going. And so when do you call it a day? And I think that's also really appealing, because with problem solving, there is never really a perfect solution, I find, and you eventually have to just decide, that's it, I'm going to put a stamp on it and move on. This is the one you're going to live with. Yeah. This one comes up in virtually every interview you see, but actionable advice for young people who are interested in editing, wanting to get into editing. I mean, I think that this is oft repeated advice of just edit whatever you can. Take the no budget job, if you're able to. Do the, if you don't have footage, do mashups, get your hands on whatever you can, just to keep the muscle memory fresh and to try new things. And I think in terms of like a career advice, it's find the people who are able to give you access to where you want to be, and make sure that they know that you want to be there. Because sometimes I find that like people aren't vocal enough about what their own ambitions are, and we all have ambitions, and it's totally fine to express what yours are. So if you want to make sure that when an opportunity comes up, somebody knows like, oh, Evan really wants to become an editor, and I have this job. If people don't know what you want to do, they can't give you opportunities. The film that I edited that arguably allowed me to stop assistant editing and continue making, being an editor, I got because one of the editors that I had assisted previously, I had lunch with him, just kind of like, I was having lunch with a different guy, and he showed up and he was like, oh, I've got this job, but I am already working, so I'm going to turn it down. And I was just like, dude, like, I'm right here, and he looked at me and was just like, all right, I'll get back to you, and he sort of like left and like thought about it. And then I just get this text message, later in the day, and he's just like, all right, don't fuck it up.